Good evening, everyone. That's a lovely thing to say. I'm staring at real people in a real room. First, I would like to acknowledge that this ground, as the campuses of the University of Sydney, are on the traditional lands of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and especially tonight and always, I'd like to pay my respect to elders past, present and future and remind us of the thousands, tens of thousands of years of cultural traditions of teaching, learning and cultural engagement that have taken place on these lands. I am absolutely delighted to be here. I must first apologise that it isn't my wonderful colleague Stephen Gilchrist introducing this as he normally does for the Linework series. He's unfortunately unwell, and so it falls to me to introduce, I think, the very first People Back in the Room event of the Powers season, so which is absolutely fantastic, I can't tell you. And it's also fantastic to be able to say, here we are in the Chau Chak Wing Museum, Nelson Mears Auditorium, another fantastic event that happened despite COVID, the completion of this museum, which brings together so many rich collections, in which I hope you've been to see the Jalkiri exhibition upstairs, and in which really allows us to do so much more here at Sydney. I hope you'll come back often. This event, and welcome everybody, by the way, online. I know that some of you may have preferred to have been sitting here, but weather and other things kept you at home, so welcome to you all too. This event is the second in a new lecture series hosted by Power, which is entitled Linework, Lines, Lineages and Networks in Indigenous Art. And the goal of the series, whose name was directly inspired by Jonathan Jones's own research, in fact, seeks to explore the rich history of Indigenous line work from the specific techniques of line drawing that express Indigenous philosophies of self and community to the methodologies of storytelling and network building that Indigenous artists and curators are using to connect their past and to other Indigenous communities across Australia and the world. The first event of the series took place in March, focused on the exhibition Welcome to the Young Foundations, which are upstairs, and looked at the longer history of Indigenous-led curatorial practices in Australia. And in 2 weeks' time, we'll be welcoming Kimberly Moulton, who'll be talking about her unique curatorial practice in a talk called Tell Me a Story, Lines and Connections Between Ancestor Objects and First Peoples Art Practices Today. I hope you'll all be able to come back for that. If you'd like to stay informed about this and any of our future events in this and other series, please sign up on powerpublications.com.au. I'm sure you've all missed this spiel that I give. It's about been a year and a half since I've been able to say it. Anyway, please sign up. But tonight, it's my really great pleasure to introduce tonight's speaker, Jonathan Jones, a member of the Wiradjuri and Kamilaroi nations of Southeast Australia and one of Australia's most important artists, researchers and curators. As an artist, he works across a range of mediums, and many of you will know his work in those mediums. I particularly think of those marvellous fluorescent light works, which are across both the Art Gallery of New South Wales and MCA. And I also will never forget Skin and Bone from 2016, the Kaldor project, which I think was extremely memorable at large scale, and in which it took its place in a very large now and an expanding body of work exhibited both nationally and internationally and collected by many state, national and international institutions. As a curator, Jones worked extensively, as you know, at the Bumali Aboriginal Artists Cooperative and at the Art Gallery of New South Wales. He's curated exhibitions across Australia, and along with Hetty Perkins, he founded the Southeast Market, which is really the only regional market for Southeast Aboriginal and artists. And as a scholar, when he wasn't doing all of this, Jonathan was getting his PhD, which is quite remarkable, in 2018, charting 4 generations of Southeast men's art practices and their shared use of the line. And this thesis, in 2019, won the Power Publications Prize for Indigenous Art Research, and he is now currently a Chancellor's Postdoctoral Indigenous Research Fellow at UTS. And so it really has been a very busy few years for you, Jonathan. The title of his talk today, which draws upon this award-winning research, is Murruwaygu, The Line in the Southeast. And after Jonathan's lecture, we'll have some time for lectures from in-person and online audiences. I can't promise that this will go wonderfully and perfectly smoothly, but with my wonderful colleague Nick, who's done so much to arrange this and other series, and thank you, Nick, we hope that we can smoothly integrate both online and in-person questions. If you'd like to ask Jonathan a question, put your hand up, I'll bring a mic to you, and then everyone will be able to hear it. So, without further ado, thank you, Jonathan, for agreeing to speak tonight, and welcome.
Dira dumarang mujigilang Yuindi Jonathan Jones paladu Wiradjuri bo Kamilaroi bo Gibipo Natu ninjamara natu nyuna ninjamara main galangu nurambangu iora garigobo main galang nyati ninjamara mujigilang inabo daendo. So my name is Jonathan Jones. Yeah, I'm a Wiradjuri Kamilaroi person from over the mountains, and I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners, the Gadigal and Eora people, and acknowledge everyone that's here tonight, and also acknowledge everyone who's tuning in and the lands that they're on. Tonight is a great opportunity for me to talk about some of my research work that I've been lucky enough to be working on for a number of years, and culminated in a exhibition and PhD, which was called Murruwaygu, following in the footsteps of our ancestors. So Murruwaygu is a word which is connected to your nose. Muru is your nose. This idea of following our nose and following the footpaths of our ancestors. Murruwaygu is a word that's connected to designs and mark making from the southeast, from my Wiradjuri language. So this idea of moving forward, following the marks and making marks is the idea that kind of really holds a lot of this narrative together. This is in fact a shot from the installation, from the exhibition, which was at the Archive of New South Wales. I should sort of say that I need to acknowledge a lot of people who have helped me along the way, but in fact it's probably Uncle Stan Grant, who has been one of the people whose kind of cultural leadership and knowledge and ways of working have really kind of sculpted how I see the world. In particular, obviously, working through a lot of language and the meaning behind our language. But in particular for this research, and I guess I just wanted to sort of frame tonight's talk, is this idea of a Wiradjuri methodology that's sitting behind the ideas, the stories, and the narrative that I'll be talking to you about tonight. So this is a methodology that we developed for the research, me and Uncle. It's based on teachings from his grandfather. And they were, I guess, 7 ways of making it, ensuring our research had yinjamara, had respect. And so this idea of just talking straight, listening deeply and acting respectfully is obviously a really important way of working. Growing knowledge, sharing knowledge and respecting knowledge is particularly important for people from the southeast. Looking after community, caring for community, knowing yourself and knowing your position, promoting Wiradjuri self-determination, building on Wiradjuri knowledge systems, and looking after country. So some of those ideas will drop in and out of tonight's talk as we go. The work that I was looking at was in particular just dealing with the southeast. As mentioned, I'm Wiradjuri Kamilaroi, so 2 of the larger nations in the southeast area. And when we talk about the southeast region, we're really talking about, I guess, what people would call today New South Wales and Victoria, the Murray-Darling River system and all the sort of coastal areas that are connected to those areas. So a huge part of the nation. It's, for me, a really significant part of Australia's story because it's where most Aboriginal people live. It's where most non-Aboriginal people live. But it's, of course, the region that Aboriginal culture is often not equated to this region. But when we look, I mean, you know, and people like Uncle Badger often reminds me not to always think in this way, but I do think it's really helpful to remind us all that, you know, within the southeast we have the world's oldest man-made structure, the world's oldest human burial, we have the world's one of the earliest ceremonial objects, all within the southeast. So it's a really significant area historically. So even on that level, you would think that people would be, I guess, cluing into some of the Aboriginal stories from this region. But in particular, for my research work, I was interested in understanding the art practices from this region. And in particular for me, as an artist that was developing, I was keen to understand other male artists from this region to try and understand where my work and my practice and ideas belonged. When we look across the board at Southeast artists, men artists from across different eras and across different places, one of the key determining factors that I became interested in was the use of the line and how the line was deployed in creating images. And that could be seen in a whole variety of artists from, as I said, from different eras who are coming at different approaches, working with different materials, mediums, and telling different stories. But line was one of the very common denominators that we could see right across the board. But when it came time to try and tell this story and distill these ideas, I guess it has been a struggle because it is such a broad net to cast. So part of my research was thinking about, in particular, 4 generations of artists and looking at within those each one of those generations a pair of artists, and that actually relates to a kinship system that comes from the southeast. The first pair that we started looking at was really a pair that was meant to talk to what we would, I guess, loosely determine as, you know, pre-contact material. So material that talked to traditional practices. And the 2 objects that we sort of clued into were the 2 types of shields that are very unique to the southeast region. It's this very sort of narrow powering shield. You would have walked past one tonight, just in that case there, that you can only see from inside the lobby, and broad shields. And one of the key reasons I guess I was keen to look at these 2 objects is that they are one of the vehicles that become highly decorated, highly used for displaying artistic ideas and stories, and they can tell us a lot. The next generation was 19th century artists. Sorry, I was just meant to be introducing things and moving quickly. 19th century artists who I guess really bore the brunt of colonisation through their practice and was sort of sitting on the cusp of colonisation. Self-taught senior sort of Koori artists with Kennedy and Hj Wedge represent an era of artists who were sort of, I guess, really sort of came out of the mission system and trying to learn how to create or to make art. Coming to their art practices quite late in life and instinctively moving towards a line tradition. And much younger, I guess what we've sort of called professional contemporary artists, artists who are very much engaged in the contemporary art world, understand the processes of galleries, exhibitions, and are highly sort of thinking about conceptual ideas. So I'll now sort of go into each one of those generations, but I guess it's important to think about the first generation of those shields and trying to understand what they mean and where they sit and how they occupy our consciousness. And that is a really difficult thing to do in the southeast because of processes of colonisation. It is really difficult for us to go back and understand what these objects mean, where they occupied, what place they occupied in our society. So a lot of the work in this area has been trying to deconstruct and decolonise the frameworks that they've been constructed around. However, as I said, you can see here, this is an install shot from the exhibition, and I should again sort of thank the Art Gallery of New South Wales. This is probably the most number of shields that were ever brought together in in Australia's history from a number of different collections, and it was a logistic task that they took on amazingly well. And I'm sad to say that I don't know that if we'll ever see this again for a long time. But the way that these objects have been collected is probably the best place to start. And these are just two examples to tell you of the very complex and violent history that they represent in many ways. The top shield there is from the Museum Victoria and is a shield that was collected. And you can see there, this shield, it's inscribed on the shield. This shield was taken in a fight between the native police and the Avoca tribe at Cheswick Creek Waterhole in July 1847. So although we don't have a lot of accounts of how objects in museums came into collections, we can start to imagine that, and I guess this is probably the worst case scenario. So after a violent sort of moment that things are collected and taken, you know, we can easily look at this happens again. This happens when Captain Cook and Banks first land in Sydney. We see an acquisition policy developed that is maintained throughout Australia's history, where people are shot at and their objects collected in that sort of aftermath. We can also see here, this is an image from Cawthorne, who was an artist working down in Adelaide, working a lot with Kaurna and Ngarrindjeri people from the Riverland. And this is documenting, he talks about how objects would be collected from Ngarrindjeri people, piled up, and then the police horses would walk over the top of them and destroy them. Similarly, when objects were collected and were preserved, they were collected under, I guess, that European eye of what they were and what they were understanding them to be, and often used in this highly decorative trophy kind of displays. And so these objects that were collected from all sorts of manners, as you can imagine, the majority of them, particularly within Sydney and in the New South Wales history, were collected and displayed in the ethnographic court at the Garden Palace in Sydney. Of course, a lot of those collections, after the World Fair left, the Australian Museum kept building their collections and storing them and displaying them in the Garden Palace. And as many of you would know, that entire collection was destroyed when that fire went through. So we lost a lot of that early collection of material. So again, for us to try and rebuild this story and to understand why we have things in our collections, why we're missing particular things in our collections, and why the Southeast is portrayed or has, I guess, a specific sort of research base around it is really important. Material that was, material that was or has remained is often from other world fairs that went around the world. This is the South Australian exhibit in the Colonial and Indian exhibition in London in 1886. And again, material that was collected and was used was often used to tell non-Aboriginal stories about Aboriginal people and perceptions of Aboriginal people and what they were doing and what their lives represented. I've always thought this was a really particular way of describing that to you. This is in fact almost like a genealogy or a perceived genealogy of material culture. And so this idea that the most basic form of material culture is a stick, and that, a slightly more advanced race turned that stick into put a knob on the end of that stick and made a club, and a slightly more advanced race turned that into something else. And so slowly that stick morphs into a gun, I guess we're meant to presume, which is meant to be the highest form. And so we can start to see here that notions of evolution, social hierarchy do get implanted on our material culture. And we need to understand our material culture does sit within this very particular narrative that's been generated to say something about Aboriginal people. part of the work that I've been doing for a number of years now is actually trying to research and document these shields and objects. And in particular, as I said, I've zoomed in on shields to try and understand them because they do hold the most surface area and have the most ability for an artist to engage with their line work. These are some of the very few stories we have around shields. This is a shield that was collected by Robert Bruce Smythe that was in the Museum Victoria. It's from the Namoi River, so up in Kamilaroi country. And Smythe, in fact, has some of the very few commentaries on this material. So although Aboriginal material amused people and I guess got them thinking, and people obviously wanted to collect that material, no one bothered to ask the artist or the community what they actually represented. So these highly decorated objects that people were very engaged with and made them very valuable and made them highly tradable, no one bothered to ask. So the one moment we have in relationship to a shield is this by Robert Smythe, which is the shield figures is imitations of the totems. The one in my possession has a figure of an iguana. So this idea that perhaps, you know, this image is a iguana that's related to someone's totem. Interestingly enough, here is also the engraving tool that was used by Simon Wonga, a Wiradjuri man from near present-day Melbourne. And this is a tool that would be used to create those designs. The other object that we have, which again Smythe is attributed to Smythe and him collecting a small bit of information, is this club here. Again, it's not a direct quote. It's been deciphered or interpreted by Smythe for us. And he's talking about the line work in this club is representing country, it's representing a lagoon and part of the Broken River. So we get these are the two small indications that we have historically from that time. But interestingly enough, sorry, and I should go back and say that, of course, this reaffirms what our elders and community have been telling us for a really long time, and I think it's best wrapped up in this quote by Rodney Carter, who's a Djadjurrung and Yorta Yorta man, who talks to these shields and the designs and talks to them as representing identity. He describes them as likens them to title deeds for houses. He says that the lines, the colours and the carvings, they tell people who you are, and more importantly, they tell people where you come from. And describes them as being very distinctive to the southeast. That is what our elders have told us, and that is what we know. So that is the kind of information that we have to run on, and that was the information that was embedded in me from a very early stage. Interestingly enough, this quote here by Smythe couples very neatly with a story that was connected to, and this is even more oblique, this is a quote of a quote. This is from an elder. We think we've worked out who that elder is, an elder who was living up in Barrangal, who describes Wiradjuri country as a line. And tracks that line through the towns and understands landscape as a line, which I think is really interesting when we think about that club and trying to imagine what these lines might be. As I said, I've been very lucky to spend a lot of time with these clubs. One of the biggest research obstacles with them, of course, as you can see, is photographs aren't particularly helpful. The photographs often get sent to me. Most collections aren't documented, but the ones that do get sent to you don't record much detail. And in fact, most of my time has been spent in museum basements, slowly drawing and rescribing the shields and trying to capture that detailed information that they hold in them. One of the things that came up through this process, and I've been doing this for years and years now, was I started to understand the hand of each artist and each artwork. And through that process, interestingly enough, things started to reveal themselves to me. This shield here is one of those breakthrough moments for me, which a shield by William Barrack, who I'll talk about later. But this was a shield, one of the very few shields that we have because we actually know it's by him. It's one of the very few shields that is actually attributed to a known artist because it has scribed on it, made by King Barrack, last of the Yarra tribe. So this is a very particular shield. It was a shield I got to draw, it was a shield I got to curate into shows, and it was a shield I got to create artworks based on working with William's ancestors. So it's a shield that I got to know very well. The lines in it, the diamonds created by those lines are very particular. Barrack has a very particular way of almost like doing this very large mainframe of creating those lines that sort of eventually come together to make a diamond grid, and then he goes and infills that grid. Other artists will create a diamond and situate another diamond next to it, and they will fluctuate in and out almost like a net. But Barrack has a very particular way of creating his diamonds. He also has a very particular way of having that negative space near the handle. And so it's a work that's very unique. So you can imagine my shock when I found another one. And this was a work that was an object that had just been acquired by the National Gallery at the time. It was a work that was by unknown artists with a number of other shields that had gone into the collection. And I think you'll agree that that negative space, of that undulating, almost like a river form running through where the handle goes, the same way that the diamonds are created, it's a very similar cross-section and form, matches perfectly to the known Barrack shield. And so this was one of those moments where I started to realise that these shields, if we spend enough time with them, we can start unpacking them and knowing what their story is. We finally managed to get the two shields together, and working with Hj Wedge Murphy, some of you would know, who is Barrack's ancestor and a senior leader down in Melbourne, getting her up to Melbourne, seeing the two shields in the same place. She wanted them together. And so this was one of those really breakthrough moments where, in fact, you know, I was lucky enough to work, and I should credit Carol Cooper, who I get to work with, who's an extraordinary researcher who I work with on Southeast material. Both of us concluded that we thought that this was Barrack's shield. But it was only until Hj came and was able to, I guess, verify that as well, that she thought that we were on the right track. So this is, for the first time in our lives, we were able to attribute a shield, and the world got to go from having one William Barrack shield to two, which is a really significant shift in the colonial kind of construct that we have to live in. Once this happened, as you can imagine, we started finding more and more examples. This is a really great source of material. This is Carl Walters went through and documented the community of Corranderk just outside of Victoria, outside of Melbourne. And you'll notice that a number of the men come in and have their portraits taken with shields or with other wooden objects. This was one of the next shields that fell into place. So this is, you can see this is Redmond, who's holding this shield. It's a very particular diamond design that folds in on itself. But we've been able to find another shield in the British Museum and starting to work with community to attribute that shield. Tara Bobby, who is from Gippsland, a very distinctive shield, a really unusual shield with circles all around the edge, a highly uniquely shield. And again, the fact that these men decided to have their portraits taken with an object is also highly significant. That again reaffirms this idea that they're connected to people's identity. But of course, this shield then went on. We found one shield. We found this half shield in the Musée Quai over in Paris, and this other shield came up on the market. And thankfully, Carol was able, who was working at the National Museum at the time, Carol Cooper, was able to secure that purchase. And again, this is extraordinary to be able to go through the archive, go through the sort of destruction of colonisation, actually start to reattribute objects to particular people and locations and regions is enormously significant. So that was a whole part of our research process. But what it proved to us that individuals were engaged in creating artworks. Individuals were telling stories, describing their identity through these works, through these line works that they were creating on shields. And that provided us a really strong, solid basis for understanding line work in the southeast. And the next generation of artists, I guess, really started to fall into place after we sort of created this sort of bedrock for them to sit on, if you like. This is the collection of shields that were part of the exhibition at the Archive New South Wales. The next group of artists were these sort of extraordinary artists who occupied the sort of 19th century and really, as I said before, bore the brunt of colonisation. The two artists are Tommy Mcrae and William Barrack. So William Barrack was born in circa 1824, which is prior to obviously the colonisation and founding of Melbourne. So he remembers Batman and the Batman Treaty. He thinks he was around 14 when the treaty was signed. And so this is a man who grew up in understanding the traditions of his people and I guess also coming to terms with what colonisation meant. Similarly, Tommy Mcrae, his biography is much more diminished. We don't know as much about where he was from, but he was definitely from and living around the Murray region. Very early on, we have documentation of him up near Albury, but he eventually moves down the river. So he's associated with those places. William Barrack was instrumental in founding Coranderrk. And I've spoken to Hj a lot about this, but there's something quite extraordinary around Barrack's career. He came to painting quite late in life. And I guess we need to understand that by this stage, the community's aspirations of establishing an Aboriginal station, which would provide for the entire community, create a safe place for community, had been destroyed by government. By every policy that we have come to know today was generated to squash Coranderrk. Everything from stolen generations to segregation policies to the welfare acts that completely diminished a group of people who wanted to look after themselves on this extraordinary station. And it's at this moment that Barrack decides to start painting. And a lot of people talk about this as perhaps this old man who is painting stories that he once remembered, and lamenting what has happened. But I think I've come to believe that he in fact was painting these stories for us in the future. He was painting time capsules for us to return to. And so I guess, his project in front of him had perhaps failed, but he has in fact planted new seeds for people to continue his work. He became really well known for images of ceremonies like this one. Within these, you can see this very highly distinctive line work, much more gestural than what we saw on his shields. His shield obviously was quite rigid mark making. Interestingly enough, you do see in particular with this one that same sort of diamond design being created to create what we think is the sort of possum skin cloaks that these male dancers have. But you'll notice too that there's a really interesting use of an abstraction of human form to create very geometric designs. So the legs are splayed out, boomerangs crossed over, and also even down here, the women with their possum skin cloaks, their cloaks almost form a continuous running line through the work. So that lineal work is highly activated here, even though both he and Mcrae are one of the first to start using introduced materials. So this is obviously paper, inks, pens, gouaches that they're engaging with, but they're continuing the use of that line work within their practice. This is extraordinary work, which again really highlights, especially with those women, that lineal design. Again, I can't help but look at the handle of that shield with that wavy pattern and think about the wavy pattern that's here created by these women. An extraordinary artist who really works in a much more expressive, much more gestural way, but continuing those practices quite clearly through his work. Quite quickly, I just wanted to hint at Carol Cooper's extraordinary work. Carol, as I said, I've been really blessed to work with Carol over the years, and a lot of her work has now been looking back at work by William and Mcrae and trying to understand their practices documentary. And this is, I think, one of the sort of gateway moments for her, which was it's quite a famous moment when the community, in fact, walked and founded Corandurk. The story was, in fact, so famous that a photo was taken, but it was a reenactment of that photo because Corandurk was, in fact, established in 1863. So the community reenacted the founding of Corandurk for this photograph. And Barrack then paints that. And this was that sort of moment that sort of triggered Carol to then start researching all of his images, because they're not just ceremonies. They're not just these blanket, when you actually, like the shields, when you actually sit down and spend time looking at them, they start revealing other things to you. And so I would encourage all of you to get his retrospective catalogue that was done by the NGV a number of years ago and read Carol's work in that, because it's quite extraordinary. The other artist from this generation is Tommy Mcrae. Oh my goodness. I'm not even halfway and I'm almost at time. So Tommy Mcrae was born around 1835, as I said, up near Albury. He worked as a stockman, and we can assume that he grew up understanding traditional life because his detailed eye that he documents it with. He was most well known for, I guess, these ceremonial images, which again, like Barrack, you can see clearly an abstraction of that figurative form to create an abstract design and enhanced by those body paintings and marks. Again, these are just a wellspring of material for anyone in the southeast. These use of tying people's headband around sticks and using them as flags within ceremonies is documented by a number of anthropologists. But you can also see here the use of gum leaves being strapped to legs for performances. Mcrae was very much involved in documenting particular stories that we can recognise quite easily. This is, of course, William Buckley, the escaped convict, who went and lived with Wathaurong people, which Mcrae often documented. It was one of his subjects that he kept coming back to. I was interested in just sort of quickly reaffirming his ability as a draftsman, as an artist. This is a photograph by John Kerr down at Fernyhurst, which was a farm. He was known to be, I guess, he let Aboriginal people live on his property. And he documented, this is one of the earliest photographs we have of an Aboriginal ceremony. And when we compare it to the ceremony by Mcrae, again, we can see that extraordinary figurative action of people's legs engaging with each other, sort of creating that chain. But one thing I always struggled with was understanding what these women were doing and their hand up. But interestingly enough, you can see those women, those three women that are there singing with their hand gestured towards the men. So we can see very clearly these acts of documentation really engaging within his work. The third generation of artists are self-taught Koori artists, so artists that really grew up in when notion of Koori art really came to the fore. Kennedy and Hj Wedge, both of them are Wiradjuri artists, or were. Hj sadly passed away. Uncle Roy was brought up on police paddock mission down near Darlington Point, and spends most of his artistic practice documenting his mission and his mother's mission, his mother's reserve, Warringazda, on the other side of the river. You can see that his works are, he sort of worked with painting, but mainly sort of championed etching, and became an extraordinary printmaker in his again short practice, because he came to work quite late in life. I guess this was for me a really important moment. I remember before Uncle Roy had his eyes done, we had an exhibition where his work was next to, we curated his work next to Tommy Mcrae, and he started talking about his work and discussing it and telling people what was in it, and he moved seamlessly on to Mcrae's work and just started talking about it as if it was his. And I'm not sure if he didn't know it was his or if he just felt connected to it, but it was that moment that I also started to think about how their works were connected, not only conceptually but through this mark making. And you can see that Mcrae working with that pen and ink, slowly scoring, almost in the same way that you carve something, slowly scratching away with a pen, dipping it into the ink, applying small lines to create that image and building up that surface, leaving very blank parts of the page, so very sort of positive, negative space. It's very connected to how Roy was working. And of course, Roy had never seen Mcrae's work ever. So it was quite a revelation for him to learn about Mcrae. But his work, again, etching process, slowly sitting there, scratching away at a plate and carving into a plate to create those images through small lines. This is probably one of his masterpiece works. This was documenting police paddock mission where he grew up. Again, storytelling and narrative is sort of, deeply embedded within his practice, and this is him talking about his works. Again, I just sort of wanted to highlight the skills of documentation and storytelling that's involved within his practice. This little church is a church that was built on the mission. It's in fact documented there. You can see the pointy little windows that were put in. This little gable opening is here on the work. And for a long time, I wondered with Uncle's work, it's not on this one, but he often shows these garden beds that are protected in the fencing. Another one of his works shows the old bridge, the old wind-up bridge that he was clearly documenting within his practice. So again, I feel like we need to take these works seriously. We need to see them as documenting parts of history, and we need to see them as important ways of understanding Aboriginal experiences. Again, within all of these works, this extraordinary use of line, constantly coming back. Hj Wedge, Wiradjuri artist, grew up in Urambi Mission. This is one of his works. He was one of the star artists to emerge out of Bulmali Aboriginal Artists Cooperative. This is a key work of his, again, combining narrative, a sort of grim story tale of these, the big bad wolf, but also at that era of, Neighbourhood Watch, but also combining native animals and stories together to sort of create these hybrid ideas of the world. A really significant moment, I was lucky enough to work with Hj for a really long time, and I noticed his practice was very unique. He would in fact paint his canvases, and he always wanted them, he preferred them stretched. And he'd paint his background, and then he would use a blunt pencil and he would score the drawing in. He'd score in the design and the marks that he wanted. And then that scoring, as you know, like when you work with canvas, it retains a bit of memory. He would then use that to paint in his story. And often, again, create these radiating lines to tell those stories. So very much building in that lineal tradition within his practice. And then finally, the younger generation of more professional contemporary artists was Stephen Payton and Rico Rennie. Hopefully, contemporary artists that people are much more familiar with with their work. Stephen's work. This was a piece that he made, which was called Cloak Combat, which was a performative, but I guess these shields became almost like these evidence of the materials of that practice and process, where he went out into the bush, dressed in complete camouflage gear, and used a crossbow to impale these shields that he made. I guess it's very much a process of thinking about the rights of hunters within Gippsland. I don't know if many of you have been to Gippsland, but there's a lot of hunting shops. Like every town has a hunting shop. Hunting's highly encouraged, and in fact, Stephen feels that the rights of hunters in those areas perhaps outweighs the rights of traditional owners to access their traditional grounds. But works with creating these shields to tell these stories. Interestingly enough, I was really keen to see a work from last year by Stephen, which I've been obviously talking to him about the shield by Tara Bobby and that really unique circles going around the edge. I was really pleased to see those circles re-emerge in his work. These are steel shields that he makes now out of pipes, commercial steel piping. I don't need to introduce Rico too much, but Rico, of course, is a Kamilaroi artist based down in Melbourne. This is a major work at the Archive in New South Wales, No Sleep Till Dreamtime, which is, of course, like a lot of his works referencing popular culture from the 90s, the Beastie Boys, the whole, I guess, connection of references within his practice. But I think Rico is in fact a really interesting place to end the story, because in many ways with his statement he completes a lot of the ideas that we've been talking about. So this idea that the emblematic statement about the royalty, that use of the crown that he constantly comes back to, the crown as a symbol of homage to his graffiti roots, but also pays tributes to Mcrae. Most importantly, symbolises the sovereign status. The crown reminds us that Aboriginal people are the original sovereigns of this country, and the diamond symbol is emblematic of his connections to Kamilaroi country and people. The diamond symbol is a family, he describes again the diamond as a family crest, and it's part of me. The hand-drawn Aboriginal flag in the form of a graffiti tag pays respect to all Aboriginal people. So within this statement, we really come full circle. It connects deeply to the images that we see on shields. It deeply connects to the images that we see with a lot of contemporary artists today. And I think this idea of understanding these artists in generations start to provide a framework for us to not only, I guess, reimagine contemporary work by understanding its references to historical work, but it in fact empowers us to see historical work through the lens of contemporary artists. So that statement of Rico's is, I believe, just as relevant to understanding this shield by an unknown artist as it is for his work. And I thought it might just be a nice place to leave it with one of our extraordinary elders from a Murruwaygu elder who passed away, but Jimmy Barker, who talked about this idea that the loss and belief of customs has not been easy for people of my generation. I still feel that some part of me is closely linked with my heritage. I might have modern views in many ways, but there's another line of thought that draws me backwards. I feel that I'm living between two worlds. And I think this idea of him understanding his heritage and trying to place it within this contemporary framework is something that we can definitely see within these four generations of artists. Thanks.
We have time for some questions, a little bit of time which I would love to encourage both by text, if you're listening to this or watching us from afar, but by real voice if you're in the room with us. So if you put your hand up, I will come to you with a roving mic, which I said I would come to you with a roving mic, I think. Maybe Nick's got it.
Or we can repeat the
Or
question.
we'll just repeat the. I'll
Thank
say it back into him. So, have I misplaced it? Ah, it's here. Hand up, and I will come to the mic and then speak when it gets to you.
It's not really a question, but it's an observation about Barrack's work. And it struck me that the lines in those figurative drawings were so insect-like. The proportions of the divisions and the lyrebird-like antennae and yeah, the subdivision looked a lot like wings and things. And I wasn't sure if you'd thought of that or observed that yourself.
In fact, that's a really good observation. The headdresses were lyrebird feathers. People would use lyrebird feathers as a headdress as part of ceremony. But I think there's an economy there that people are engaging with, obviously, to represent those stories. So there's an economy of how to create that figurative form. And I see that there's also a strong, process of leaning into geometric forms to tell stories. So I think there is a relationship to represent figures in that way that has a geometric format because it's part of a much bigger tradition.
Yes.
Thanks so much. Is it on? Okay. I just had a kind of marginal question about the shields. I was curious about the kind of condition of the objects and patterns of wear and tear and things like that, and if there's anything you can deduce from that kind of information about usage or differences of usage and things like that.
Yeah, one of the things that I've been trying, it's quite difficult to. I've been trying to resist shields, but it's a word that's really helpful for us in so many ways because obviously the Southeast is made up of over 60 different nations, each of them having their own word for that shield. I highly caution their use of shields. In fact, most of the documentations that we have show them as highly significant objects within ceremonies. We in fact go to one of the first ceremonies documented here in Sydney, down at the Botanic Gardens, where all the men have their shields in that ceremony and are holding them into the centre of and making this extraordinary circle with all their shields. This idea that they were used, because I guess, this idea of shields denotes violence. When we look at the materials that were collected in our institutions, it's mostly men's work. So this idea of the noble savage was alive and true. So to collect work by women and children would very much bring the story of the noble savage undone. So when we look at museums' collections, they are mainly men's work. And they've been highly politicised in that sort of language of violence, that noble savage of people clubbing each other and engaging with violence. So most of those objects have some sort of weird violent connotation to them. So I really resist understanding shields as part of that process. I also just don't think that if you spent that amount of time creating something so beautiful, would you really use it and in that way where it gets destroyed? There was one shield that was traded up the Murray, and it was talked about and it was described as a shield that was a really special shield that was traded up the Murray that was slowly cared for and repaired. So there is a real cultural relationship to those objects that I think sits beyond our understanding of what shields are in a Western construct.
More questions in the room. I'm going to hand the mic. It's a bit peculiar here. I'm going to hand the mic to Nick so he can repeat some of the questions we've got for you on the test.
Hi, Jonathan. So I'm channeling a question from John Clark, who's a professor here at the university, and he asks, was Barrack self-consciously making his claim to being an artist by being photographed in front of an easel, holding a brush to it, or was this situation merely haphazard, or indeed due to a suggestion by the photographer?
Yeah, this is a really interesting question, and I'd recommend everyone read Jane Lydon's book in relationship to Aboriginal communities and their relationship to photography, because the Corondit community had a very particular relationship to photography and understanding the power of photography. We're talking about a community that, and a man with Barrack who was highly political. Like, this is a man who was constantly engaging with the government of the day, creating petitions and campaigning for the rights of his community. So they were very aware of the power of the camera, and had good relationships, in fact, with Carl Walters, who took most of those photographs. And I guess the one thing we need to remember about William Barrack is, at that time, he was the most famous Aboriginal person ever. That was the person that anyone thought of Aboriginal people. He was the most famous Aboriginal because he was touted as the last of the Yarra tribe. This whole idea of him being the last of that community. So it became a real, he became, I guess, a false celebrity, in that way, this, and so he was documented a lot. And it's really hard to know, but I think someone who, what has been really helpful about that image is it shows that we can now see how he worked. He was working on upright, that sort of perspective. We can see that he was, and we know where that work is that he was working on. So I think he probably would have understood to use it in that political context, and definitely would have understood the power of that image, because he was obviously highly engaged in making images himself. Yeah, sorry, long answer.
Thank you. I have a few more questions coming in.
Okay.
I have one from Rox DeLuca, who's joining us from Warramie Land. And she says, Jonathan has touched on my question a little, but how much is identified to be women's work?
Oh, yeah, look, I guess, and I should state really clearly that my research process, being an Aboriginal man, was obviously following and working within a traditional format, which is working with Aboriginal men's stories. So for me, that was my path that was clearly set for me. It would be actually really strange for me as an Aboriginal man to be researching Aboriginal women's stories. So this is highly specialised in that area. And as I said before, the real issue is that when we look at collections made in the 1800s, and I dare say even later, that those collections were often, were predominantly men's work. And I think there's obviously a few reasons for that. As I suggested before, the promotion of the noble savage is, I think, in particular during the southeast, highly significant. But then when we start moving into other regions of Australia, I do think the prevalence of male anthropologists or pseudo-anthropologists at best would have a major influence on the, obviously, men showing up. Men will talk to men within an Aboriginal context. So sadly, it is true that a lot of women's material was wasn't as reported, and especially for the southeast is nowhere near to the same level, which is really sad. I know there's a lady who is working on her PhD looking at southeast baskets. Antoinette Smith, who's Palawa and Wiradjuri, and she has been looking at baskets from the southeast and trying to go through the same process of studying stitches to try and track those stitches and see if we can start locating them to particular regions.
Thank you. I have a couple more questions.
Oh.
A quick comment from Natalie King, curator, says thank you for a wonderful and scholarly lecture. Ilaria Akariji says, hi, Ilaria here. I would like to ask Jonathan to expand on the act of drawing as a way of knowing the objects. Yes, they might need your act of drawing.
And full disclosure, Ilaria, supervisor. So I guess what was really interesting and probably more revealing for me was I remember taking these stories of these shields, because we've now got countless cases of shields that we can attribute to particular regions and artists. It's a project that I had no idea would be so fruitful. And I talked to Uncle Stan. I said, what's the story? Like, you know, I don't understand why people were missing this. Like, to me, it's really obvious now. Like, you can see the shield just like this shield. Why would no one have seen this before? What's going on? And Uncle said to me, Yinjamara. Yinjamara is, you've shown them respect. Like, Yinjamara is just respect. So this idea that you've actually sat down with them, you've shown them some respect, you've drawn them, you've spent time with them. That process of showing respect to something. And in fact, in Wiradjuri, Yinjamara means to go slow, but it literally means to go slow, but it gets translated as just respect. So that idea of sitting down and drawing something and spending time with it, you know, is so valuable. You know, it's something that I guess we've lost with that act of taking so many photographs on our camera. We completely lose the ability to use our eyes and understand something.
And I have one more question from online, which I'm very pleased is from Kimberly Moulton, who's our next speaker in the series. And Kimberly says, asks, have you found any links along southeastern songlines to particular patterning on the cultural material like shields and clubs linked to particular regions?
Yeah, this is something with me, because the one thing I sort of hinted at this a little bit, and big shout out to Kimberly, looking forward to her talk. But the one thing that I've been really interested in tracking is, because if most Southeast communities will say they own diamonds. Diamonds are theirs, like, you know, and they love their diamonds. And, you know, you can go to schools and people will have put diamonds on, like, you know, school covers. People will, you know, use diamonds as this really fantastic form of cultural expression. And so I do think there's something really interesting that needs to be done in tracking those together and putting those stories and lining them up and seeing what they mean and how they work together. So I haven't found anything directly yet, but there's just the one thing I would encourage, you know, and there's some young Wiradjuri researchers in the room, is we've got so much work to do. And that's, I guess, one of the most exciting things about our region is the volume of work that we have to do that actually wakes up these stories and brings them back and honours the work that hard work that those ancestors did for us to activate.
Thank you, Jonathan. I mean, I have to say that without wanting to risk a kind of cultural insensitivity, what you are describing in your own practice, in your own research, and is a kind of fantastically thoughtful and respectful version of what used in the very old days or the very early days of art history used to be called connoisseurship. In other words, the matching, the very complicated work of seeing as much as one could and matching as many patterns, thoughts, hands as one could. Of course, it was all done in a very Western-oriented, great master thing, but what you've brought back some of those tools in a much more community-focused or much more, I think, a more subtle way. But it nevertheless asks for skills that you've just pointed out. Many of us have stopped teaching, or many of us have not allowed to take place. It's only now that we're able to have teaching rooms down in this museum that we can actually get generations of students not afraid of objects anymore, actually unafraid to go into archival spaces and look for them. And I'm really glad to hear you encouraging people to do that. We want to do that too, because I think this is work that we can train in some general way, and that then combining that with the knowledge, traditions, and sort of respect that you wish to add to it, I think there is some hope that we can make some progress on this. And it's a very sort of optimistic thing you just said at the end there, even though it's a lot of work for many people. And, are there any other live questions that anyone would like to ask? Yeah, one or two more, and then we better wrap up.
I was wondering, have you found any links in your studies to the thousands of rock carvings that surround us on the East Coast and in the Sydney Basin? Have you found any connection
Yeah, not me per se. We have. It was something me and Carol have been trying to work at and look at, because there has to be some correlations. But I think what we need, and I guess what's interesting about what we've been talking about tonight, is that way of making the line, and the carving practice, which is really about, gouging something out, working with those tools, that's slowly gouging away at wood, that sets up a set of parameters that, you are able to maintain these extraordinarily fine lines and create extraordinary detail, which, we've seen, gets picked up and mirrored by penmanship or paintbrush, or even etching. So I think it's really difficult to then look at some of those other practices which, I guess demand a different artistic outcome almost, that they become quite different in their expressions. I do know there's been some really fantastic work looking at the shields around Sydney, because as we know, some of the shields around Sydney are these beautiful elliptic shields, which often had like a really simple line design. So one line going down and 3 or 2 or different configurations. And there's been some really interesting work looking at documenting the shields that are imprinted in the Sydney rock art, that show those designs and the hypothesising of, are those shield designs relating to different clans from Sydney, and can that actually tell us something? So there has been some work in there, definitely.
Okay, I think we better leave it there. That's a very generous response to many questions, both online and live in the room. Jonathan, it's been an absolute pleasure. We hope you'll be back to talk to us a great deal more and to explore our collections and many others. Please join me in thanking Jonathan very much, and looking forward to 2 weeks' time when Kimberly will be here. Thank you very much.